Nick Sirianni has not been a good head coach in 2024, but Howie Roseman and Jeffery Lurie, they're as much to blame for the situation as Nick. We'll get into it on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Wednesday edition of the podcast that we're brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL, which is in all capital letters, for $20 off your first purchase. Getting ready for Eagles Buccaneers, a revenge game for the Birds in Tampa Bay this Sunday, 1 o'clock kickoff. Finally, a couple back-to-back 1 p.m. games. I love that, which means I feel like I'm getting old. I'm sure a lot of older listeners and viewers will roll their eyes at that statement, but yeah, the primetime games, I know it's a compliment to the Eagles because they're good and they are fun, but I love sometimes being done at 4 o'clock with all the Eagles coverage and getting to watch the rest of the games. So I'm excited that they're playing at 1 o'clock against Tampa Bay, and this is a big game for their psyche, and we're going to take a first look at that matchup coming up later on in the podcast. But I wanted to get into another angle of this whole Nick Sirianni situation. And you guys know I've been talking about how I dislike this coaching setup very much so. And I have not liked it since the Eagles made their decision in the offseason to retain Nick Sirianni as the head coach. They brought in Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio. It was very obvious Sirianni was going to be kind of neutered when it comes to his responsibilities as the head coach. He wasn't going to be running the offense anymore. He certainly would have even less say when it comes to the defense with Vic Fangio running that unit. And I just really dislike that. I want a head coach that, number one, the team trusts to run the offense, to call plays. And if he had that responsibility and you have to take it away from him, then you should probably find a new head coach. He just doesn't do a lot right now as a head coach that's quantifiable. And the main thing he's doing that's quantifiable when it comes to in-game decisions, when it comes to, when to go for it on 4th down, when to kick the field goal in the red zone, or when to go for the touchdown, when to be aggressive versus a little bit more controlled, a little bit more conservative. When it comes to penalties and self-discipline from this football team, the little mistakes, the little details that he should have time to work on more now as the head coach because he's not running the offensive system. He's not calling plays. He's failing at that. So does that mean Nick Sirianni's having no positive impact on this football team? Absolutely not. I think this locker room, he's got this locker room still. Like, they want to play for Sirianni. They want to fight for this guy. That's not quantifiable, and it is a positive trait. He is a good leader, in my opinion. However, I don't think that's enough for him to be the long-term head coach. And you guys know I've been saying that since the offseason. I want a head coach that runs the offense, that calls plays, that when you have success and you're losing coordinator after coordinator, things don't have such dramatic change year in and year out for your football team. And so this year, the setup has frustrated me. Even if there has been some success with the coordinators, there really hasn't been a lot of success with Nick Sirianni. And we're blaming Sirianni for that. We're saying the Eagles are winning in spite of him, which I think is correct. I've made that same statement on this podcast for multiple weeks now, really all 3 football games. I thought they won both games in spite of their head coach. I think they lost that game against Atlanta mainly because of their head coach. He's not the only reason, but he's, to me, a main reason. So we should blame Nick Sirianni for the Eagles' ups and downs to start the 2024 season. However, we can also blame Howie Roseman and Jeffery Lurie for putting this organization in this situation to begin with. Because instead of, when they lost faith in Nick as the head of the offense, when they lost faith in Sirianni as the play caller, and you can say that Sirianni was the one that gave up play calling duties to Shane Steichen, and I believe that's true. You could say that he hired Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio this offseason. I think he had a say in it. But let's be real. Howie Roseman and Jeffery Lurie, they have their hands on those decisions more than any general manager and owner in football. Like, this is not a head coach-led football team at all. The head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles has as little power as pretty much anybody in that position when it comes to all 32 teams in the NFL. And so instead of moving on from Nick when they lost faith in him with all of these responsibilities, they set up this situation. They constructed this design where the team doesn't really, I don't want to say they don't need the head coach, but the head coach does not carry the same value and responsibilities as other teams. They were okay with the coordinators running the units, and because they have such control over the team operations, which they want, and it's caused so many rifts with past head coaches before, Chip Kelly, Doug Peterson, because of all of that, and they've always wanted say in the coordinators, especially when the head coach struggles. But even when they hire him initially, they want input on that. Because of all of this, they were okay with this kind of setup this year instead of just moving on and finding a head coach that they trust to run everything. And I think a huge part of that is, yes, sure, I think they like Nick Sirianni. I think Lurie does believe he can be a really good CEO type of coach that inspires his team and is a good leader, right? And can do the small things really well. But to me, I think it more so has to do with that they don't value the head coach like other teams do because of the control that they want, because of the setup they want when it comes to the coordinators. And I think that that's been shown directly in the types of head coaches they've hired. They've brought in brand new guys that are new to being a coach. They're mostly coordinators or young guys that are just starting in the leagues. One was a college coach. And so those guys aren't going to fight for power. But then when they have some success and then it's followed by some struggles and Howie and Lurie want to get their hands deeper into the operation and that coach feels like his toes are stepped on, they start to push back. Doug Peterson did that. Chip Kelly did that. And Nick Sirianni, I don't feel like he's pushing back. But, like, for instance, him calling a trick play on 4th and 1 with 14 seconds left in a half where you're only really going to get one more chance at the end zone, him taking back the reins from Kellen Moore, that is, to me, a direct rebellion against Howie Roseman, a direct act of rebellion against Howie and Lurie. And again, you can say Nick was the mastermind behind this coaching setup and giving the keys to Kellen Moore. He okayed it, I'm sure, because if he didn't, he would have been fired. Doug Peterson, after 2020, did not okay this exact same setup, and he moved on from Philadelphia. Nick had to okay it, but let's be real. This was not his plan. This was Howie Roseman and Jeffery Lurie's plan, because, again, it was the exact same plan that Doug Peterson said, I'm not cool with. And so this awkward situation they're in that now is having Nick act out when it comes to these trick plays, and it's evident that he's struggling in other areas as a coach that doesn't have to do with play calling and game planning. A lot of that has to do with Howie Roseman and Jeffery Lurie. Like, that's on full display because that's all Howie and Jeff are letting him do right now, and he's not doing a good job at that either. So I think they should have just moved on. And maybe I'm being too pessimistic when it comes to Nick, but you guys know what I want in a head coach. I've explained it a lot on this show, and I'm not saying, again, he doesn't do a lot of positives for this football team. I think he does. I think he's a good hands-on developer. I do think he runs the right type of training camp and practice schedule, and I think he is a good leader. I think he can inspire this football team, and he does have the right message, especially for a younger team. Like, I think he can be a head coach you win with. But are you ever winning because of Nick Sirianni? I don't think so. And I think sometimes you've been winning in spite of Nick Sirianni over the last 2 years. But the situation they're in right now, I think Lurie and Howie have a lot of the blame with that because they're okay with this kind of setup as opposed to bringing in a more powerful head coach or making change. Like, they like this because they like the power. They want the say. And yeah, I think that's a main part of it. And they want more and more say the more the head coach struggles. And so it just reminds me a little bit too much of the end of Doug Peterson. And the Eagles are just too talented for a 2020 type of regression to come. But at the same time, with Nick, it's a completely different situation. Even if the Eagles continue to have somewhat success where they make the playoffs every year, but they're not close to competing for a championship, his judgment is different than I think just the state of the team wins and losses. So I don't know. I think Howie and Jeff, like, they're a main reason for the current setup and situation, this awkward situation at head coach. So I think they deserve a lot of the blame as well for why things are not working right now with Nick in a vacuum. Not with the team, but with Nick in general. Because I don't think Nick is really helping you win football games right now. But at the same time, he is the head coach. He's got to get these guys ready for hopefully another win against Tampa Bay. It's not going to be easy. It's a revenge game. The Eagles are pretty banged up. We'll take a first look at that matchup coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's right, $200 in bonus bets when you place your first $5 bet. You don't even have to win the bet. However, LOE3, me and Gino are on a hot streak. I went 3-0 again this week for the second straight week. After starting 0-3 week 1, I'm 6-0 in the last 2 games, taking player props on FanDuel for the Eagles matchups. You can take the Eagles money line, the over-under, so much more. Again, just bet $5 and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. Visit FanDuel.com to look at odds and include the Eagles in your bets. I promise you, I think you're going to win some money. Just follow us right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. We're sponsored by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Eagles Buccaneers 1 o'clock kickoff this Sunday, and this is an important one. This is a revenge game. And sometimes that doesn't carry that much weight, like avenging a loss from previous years, like even if it's a playoff game. Sometimes that really doesn't matter if the team's very different, depending on the situation. The context of it matters. But this revenge game, it really does matter for the Eagles. They can go back to a place of their biggest demons from 2021 to 2023. A lot of their most embarrassing, like most revealing losses have come in Tampa Bay. And both of them came in the wild card round of the playoffs, 2021 and 2023. This is such an important game for the psyche of this football team. And they can say it's just another game. But Jalen said last year, after they beat Tampa Bay, remember on that Monday Night Football game, week 3, he said after that win, that he didn't forget about the loss in 2021. He remembers what that felt like to lose a playoff game in that building, and it felt good, and he was motivated by that to get a win against the Buccaneers in 2023. So for me, I think they're going to carry that same kind of motivation into this one, if not more, because last year, 2021, they were playing Tom Brady and the reigning Super Bowl champs. The Eagles were a fringe 7 seed at 9-8 that was super young. Jalen Hurts was not who he is now. They were just probably happy to be there. Hurts will deny that, but there weren't a lot of expectations for that football team. Last year, there absolutely were. They were trying to run it back and win a Super Bowl, finish what they started in 2022, and the Tampa Bay game was the final nail in the coffin of the biggest collapse in NFL history for a Super Bowl contender. Like, that's not an understatement. That was the biggest collapse in NFL history for an actual contender. So getting that monkey off your back, and of course it's not a playoff game, it's not going to fully avenge it, but beating Tampa Bay and getting a win in that building where the Eagles, Jalen Hurts especially, has had some brutal losses, that's really, really important for this team. And I honestly can never forget that game last year because, man, for even as bad as they played to finish off the regular season, I really thought a playoff game last year could change things. I thought it could re-energize this team, reinvigorate them. If they could get a postseason win, like they could still go on a run and be road warriors, kind of like the 2018 Eagles were, and go on this unexpected run. Like I really thought going into Tampa Bay, which I thought was a favorable matchup, that there was still hope. And that's maybe a stretch considering how bad they looked against, the Seahawks and blowing the win against the Cardinals, like losing that game, getting blown out by the Giants in the Meadowlands. Like maybe it was a stretch to believe that team was still alive, but I really thought they still were. I thought there was like a slimmer of hope heading into that game. And then the way they came out so flat, I haven't been that angry, embarrassed, shocked at the Eagles before that since, I don't know, 2009 probably. It's most likely been 14, 15 years where the Eagles that year were 11-5, one of the best offenses in football. They play the Dallas Cowboys week 17. They get blown out in a winner takes the NFC East matchup. They have to go right back to Dallas the following week in the wild card round, and they get blown out again. Like, that was shocking, embarrassing, anger-inducing. You get blown out by your biggest rival back-to-back in massive games, one for the division, one to stay alive in the postseason. That was probably the last time I was that, embarrassed about the Eagles. A good Eagles football team, I should say. And they need to right that wrong. This game is really important to them. It's not going to be easy, though. They're battling injuries. A.J. Brown, yet again today, did not practice this hamstring injury. It might be worse than we thought. Maybe they're just being extra cautious. Hamstring injuries are very nitpicky. They're very tough. And it's hard to judge, when they're good to go. When are they 100%? A.J. Brown, I believe, dealt with some of this in the past in Tennessee, so maybe it's a cautious approach. Hopefully the injury is not as, more serious than we thought it would be, but he did not practice again. We know DeVonta Smith is still in concussion protocol. I think he's likely going to miss this football game. Mekhi Becton was a limited participant with that hand injury. Lane Johnson suffered a concussion on Sunday as well. He did not practice, so the Eagles could be missing 4 key starters on offense. However, the good news is the Buccaneers are also dealing with a ton of injuries. So if you look at their practice report today, Kalijah Cansey, their first-round pick from a few years ago, defensive tackle, he did not practice. Antoine Winfield Jr., which he could be the biggest game wrecker considering Jalen Hurts' turnovers. Winfield, I think, is the best safety in football. Maybe if not the best, he's top 5 for sure. He did not practice with a foot injury, which kept him out of last week's game against Denver. So they might not be with 2 of their top 3 best defensive players, Kalijah Cansey, Antoine Winfield. Vita Vea, their elite nose tackle, was a limited participant. He missed last game too. Chris Godwin was a limited participant, so was Mike Evans. The Bucs are banged up. So both teams are dealing with injuries to very key players. It's not just a random okay starter. It's really good players. So both teams are going to have to deal with some adversity, but the Eagles, it's not going to be easy without potentially 2 of your starting offensive linemen, both on the right side, without your top 2 receivers. You need a big game because Tampa's going to hone in on Dallas Goedert. They're going to double him a lot, I think, like New Orleans did in the fourth quarter of that football game. You need Jahan Dotson, you need Johnny Wilson ready to step up more than they've been the last few games. I don't know, though, if it's really Dotson's fault. I think maybe I've seen him make plays. I know this kid in Washington. Was he a 1,000-yard first-round type of receiver? No. I mean, he only had a little over 500 receiving yards in back-to-back years. But we saw him make plays down the field. We saw him make contested catches. We saw him create separation in the slot, on the outside. We know this kid can play. Maybe he just needs more targets, more chances from Jalen, and maybe he'll get that in this football game. He's going to have to get that in this football game if both Smith and Brown are out. You'd like Brown to play and give them one of those guys, but I don't know. I'm not feeling good about that since he still is not practicing and we're heading into Thursday. We're only a few days away from this game. So they really need those guys to step up. They need to be open for those hot reads because Todd Bowles, we know, he likes to blitz, and he especially likes to blitz Jalen Hurts. We saw that in the playoff game last year. But this is a different Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts is completing over 70% of his passes when he faces the blitz. Last year, he was just a little bit over 60%. Jalen has been so much better in that area. I think he's ready. But again, without 2 receivers that are elite at getting open on those quick hot reads, his young guys are going to have to step up. Johnny Wilson, Jahan Dotson. Britton Covey's also dealing with an injury that's going to keep him out of this football game. They need the young guys to step up for sure. Jahan Dotson especially. This is why Howie traded a third-round pick for this kid. But overall, I think the Eagles have a really good chance of winning this game. Like I said, Tampa Bay, they're really beat up. And do they have any game wreckers? Here are the top 4 guys I say you have to stop to win this game. Since Antoine Winfield Jr. is not playing, and same potentially with Vita Vea and maybe Kalijah Kancey, I'd say it's their big 3 at quarterback and receiver. You got to stop Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield's been really good lately. He is legitimate. And he's just further proof that situation, it means so much for a quarterback's development. He's finally in a good spot, and look how well he's playing. This year, he's completing 74.4% of his passes. He has 637 yards in 3 games, a 110.7 rating, 6 passing touchdowns to just 2 interceptions. Baker Mayfield, he's the first guy you got to stop. If you can get to him with a pass rush, finally, especially on the edge, I think you can win this football game. You got to stop Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. That's going to be a fun matchup. Quinyon Mitchell and Darius Slay against Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And then Yaya Diaby. He's a good player out of the draft a few years ago. One of their edge rushers. Diaby was a full participant today. He's a good player to watch on their defense. A banged-up defense, if there's one guy they got to make sure they contain, it's Diaby, especially if he's on the side of Fred Johnson, who will likely start at right tackle with Lane Johnson still dealing with a concussion. So overall, those are the top players I say you got to stop. I'm really looking forward to that Quinyon and Slay versus Evans and Godwin matchup. But overall, there's nobody on Tampa Bay that I'm just terrified of them beating you. Even their run game, I like Bucky Irvin a lot. I think he looks really good. And I think he's a good player in outside zone, which is something the Eagles have struggled with this year, stopping the run in outside zone. But the Buccaneers are just 27th in rushing yards this year, both total and yards per game. So they're a bottom-tier running offense. If you can create pressure on Baker Mayfield, if Quinyon and Slay can contain Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, the Eagles should be able to win this football game even without Smith and Brown. Run the football, run it through Saquon Barkley, get Dallas Goedert the ball in space. Dotson and Wilson, you got to step up more than you have, make a couple big plays, and I think the Eagles can get revenge for what happened in Tampa Bay last year. All right, we're going to wrap up this Wednesday edition of the show with what's more likely. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp Online Therapy. What's something that you'd love to learn? As an adult, do you make time to learn new things as often as you'd like? Or was that lost in your childhood somewhere? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. What's something you'd like to learn? Gardening, a new language? I want to learn Italian before I go to Italy to visit my family over there. If they don't speak a lick of English, I want to learn Italian. Maybe how to finally beat your best friend who's the king of bowling. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back-to-school era, it can come at any age. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/LockedOn for 10% off your first month of online therapy. All right, we're wrapping up this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. As we always do, what's more likely? We've got one of our latest what's more likely questions from one of our listeners, Brian, who wrote in from our email chain, actually, which you can, I don't think I ever mentioned this. We do have an email account that you can send questions to if you're not a X guy or a YouTube communities participant, lockedoneaglespodcast@gmail.com. Brian writes in, what's more likely for Sunday's matchup in Tampa Bay? Bryce Huff has at least 2 sacks, or Jahan Dotson, has over 70 receiving yards. Thanks, Brian, for that question. Interesting. So Jahan Dotson, not done much since the Eagles traded a third-round pick for him right before the season started. Just a couple catches the last few games. Bryce Huff, we know, has been the biggest bust of any offseason move Howie made this year. 0 pressures again in that game against New Orleans, was 4th in snaps among all edge rushers. I don't know. I think I still want to believe that Huff has that Jets pass rush in him. I don't believe anymore that he can be a full-time run-stopping player that's going to justify that, $17 million contract. But I do think he can still be that elite, efficient pass rusher on third downs that he was with the Jets. Like, there's no way that just went away. And it wasn't just last year that Bryce Huff was that efficient on the edge for New York. Like, it was multiple years in a row. He was top 10 in pass rush win rate and pretty much every efficiency metric you can pull up for a pass rusher. So I want to believe still there is a couple games in him this year that he can have big sack totals. I like Jahan Dotson a lot. I don't think Smith or Brown are going to play in this game, so I think he's going to get a lot of targets. But I would say over 70 yards, that still might be a stretch considering the offense is going to run through Saquon Barkley and Dallas Goedert. I think they'll run a lot of 12 personnel. Greg Calcaterra will probably be involved pretty regularly. 70 yards isn't a lot for a first-round pick, right? That's the wide receiver 1 this week, especially with Tampa Bay's secondary banged up. But I want to believe, maybe it's a heart pick over a head pick. I want to believe it's Bryce Huff getting at least 2 sacks. I don't know. Again, I mentioned this yesterday on the show. Maybe Fangio needs to say right now, okay, your brain is just spinning. You're thinking too much on the field. You're trying way too hard when it comes to, just being a run defender. But then because you're thinking about that so much, maybe this isn't true. This is just an assumption. Maybe because you're thinking about that so much, you're not ready when it's time to go after the quarterback. I don't know. Maybe it's a mental thing. It's a lack of confidence thing. Maybe he's just not as good as we thought, and he's getting tougher matchups. Offenses are focusing on him more. I don't know. That can't be true, though, because he was one-on-one with a tight end on Sunday, and he was still losing battles. So it's got to be a confidence thing because he was so good at getting to the quarterback for 2 years. The run defense thing is a real concern, and he's never done it before. So odds are he will never become, or he's not going to become, that elite run stopper on the edge. Like that probably, he's not going to be Brandon Graham most likely. But for that pass rush to just go away, maybe, again, what I was starting to allude to there was Fangio just says, let's just focus on you playing obvious passing situations on third down. We'll get a 5-man front to help out with the run. Let's just get you to pin your ears back and go get the quarterback. Maybe Bryce Huff's just better in that kind of defense, a Jim Schwartz style of defense. I'm not sure, but I still want to say it's more likely Huff gets 2 sacks. Tampa Bay, by the way, they do have a banged-up starter on their offensive line. Luke Goedeke, who is a tackle, so maybe you try to get Huff lined up on that side where there's a backup tackle. Maybe you try to stunt him more. Maybe you try to line him up, use him like you use Zach Bond, where he's standing up and then he moves to the edge, or, he blitzes through the A gap or the B gap. I don't know. You got to try something. I want to still say it's more likely Bryce Huff gets 2 sacks, but I do believe Jahan Dotson is still a really solid playmaker, and now that he's going to be forced to have more targets, I think he will step up with those more targets. I think it's tough to really judge if he's been good or not through 3 weeks because he just really, they don't look his way that much, right? So I have to go back and watch the tape and see if he's creating separation, but I think both things are likely. I think both things could happen. Both are possible, I should say, not likely. Between the two, what's more likely, though? Maybe for one more week, I'll say Huff has a multi-sack game. After this game, though, if he still does nothing, I might be pulling the plug soon on this for sure when it comes to confidence, which is already pretty shot, but I still want to believe that's in him. I just don't want to believe yet that this is a Nnamdi Asomugha, Byron Maxwell type of signing. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe, again, that's just the heart, but I'll say Huff with at least 2 sacks on Sunday. Not predicting it. It's what's more likely, that or Jahan Dotson getting 70 yards or more in this football game. All right, Gino Camilleri, my co-host, will be back tomorrow with James Yarko of Locked On Buccaneers to preview this matchup, crossover Thursday. We'll have LOE 3 on Friday as well. Still 2 more shows for you before Eagles Buccaneers on Sunday. So subscribe on all podcast platforms and on YouTube as well. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.